Okay, so how this is going to work is Bob has the first part, then I'm going to do the middle, and Bob's going to do the end. And I just suggested to him that he incorporate a dance routine in since it's so late in the afternoon and we don't want to bore you, so he's going to do that on the fly. But before we started, we asked Monique to add a picture to our PowerPoint in honor of Tony because of what he said this morning about the difficulty of capturing our Mount Storm Park deer and that they were giving him such headaches. This is a picture, if you see the two untagged deer in this deer family, we have named those two untagged looking suspiciously at the camera. We've named them Thelma and Louise. And they're the ones who are giving Tony headaches that he referenced this morning. So thanks, Monique, for adding that in. Tony, I'm sure you're glad to see them again. Okay, so I'm turning over the first part of the presentation to Bob.
All right. I know the nicest thing we could do is just call off our presentation, let you all head to the bar, but we're not going to do that. Okay. So as Laurie said, we're going to do this in three parts. Starting with who are we? So we've been introduced, but you'll notice one thing right off the top, there are no PhDs or science credentials listed on those top three names. As a matter of fact, we have about a year into our program, a scientist joined us. She works with the CDC. Up until then, it's been lawyers and social workers. What do we know about deer? 4 years ago, we didn't know anything about deer, except that we love seeing them eat the apples from the tree in our yard until, and this is probably a very similar story, and probably most of the stories begin this way, but the Cincinnati parks, who do lethal calling, archery calling in several of the parks, we have many, announced that they were going to come to our community, Clifton, and they were going to begin calling in our parks. Well, we have that very proverbial granddaughter who plays in that park, and we thought, how are we going to explain the scenario that was described? And besides that, Laurie and Chris are really among those people with deep animal sensibilities that I think some people have uniquely. I end up having sort of a similar sensibility, but I have it for trees. So when the park said they were going to start calling because they thought that the deer population was creating an ecological problem for our parks and for our forests, we realized that we couldn't just keep saying no, we had to do something more constructive. That wasn't the way everybody reacted to this. So when they came and made an announcement to the Clifton Town Meeting, which is our neighborhood organization, community council, there was an outcry. There were, our community, I was supposed to tell you, and I'm supposed to run this thing here. Hold on a second. Our community is, as others that have been described, it's an urban right outside of the central business district. We do have several parks in it. The three contiguous ones that we're concerned with comprise about 100 acres. The community contains multiple hospitals and the University of Cincinnati, so we have a pretty highly educated population, and it is, I suppose, leans to the liberal side as well. The man who runs the park's culling program is a friend of ours. He's a naturalist. He's very committed to ecology. We respect and trust his judgment. When he said that the parks were facing an ecological problem, unlike many of the other people that began protesting, we trusted him. We believed him. I guess I'm supposed to be doing this. So just to summarize, where we are now is we started this 4 years ago. We're 3 seasons in, sterilizing seasons. We're seeing success. Tony told us we need 95% to see a significant population reduction. We hope to get to by the end of this year, be there. Although we've already seen a pretty good reduction already, and our deer seem to be very healthy. There isn't much by way of auto accidents, so the attrition rate has been kind of low. But I think, just anecdotally, we also see a reduction in browsing. It's my personal opinion, because I watched that pretty carefully. And I suspect that is a symptom or an evidence of the belief that sterilized does browse less, eat less. So as I told you, it started with the parks coming to the community. The community, a bunch of people just jumped up and down. I warned Jim Godby, the guy that runs our parks, the culling program, that when he got to Clifton, he wasn't going to get the same response he did elsewhere. Chris and Laurie went to that meeting. It didn't go the way he hoped. There were some pretty loud protests, and the community put it off again. And for another meeting, they came back, they tried again. This time they brought a lot of the hunters that work in the culling program, who kind of sat in the back and looked serious and upset. Chris and Laurie said, gee, they started doing some research on alternatives, and obviously fertility control that's what looked promising. They said, can we just buy a little time? Can you stall this? Because this culling, which was scheduled to begin very soon, and they said, no. That was probably a mistake. So, everybody talks about this. This was just stunning to me, to us, the range of passionate feelings and opinions and values that people brought to this question. We took a different approach. We said, we believe you, we're not going to challenge you, we agree something needs to be done. So the question is what and how. We arranged for some good press coverage in which Chris and Laurie praised the parks, didn't challenge them, acknowledged the need, and said, we just want to see if we can find a more humane way to do it. We lobbied the director of the parks and did our best to present to him evidence that we were rational, reasonable people. And given that his alternative was people who were wearing hazmat outfits and protesting on the street corners, I think he thought if he lets us, joins with us, maybe he can point to that as a solution they're working on and avoid more of the controversy. He then contacted us and invited a collaboration. We accepted that and tried to bring together all of the people who were doing the objecting and worked for quite some time trying to do that. I told the park director I'd been mediating federal litigation for a long time. I really thought I could bring this group together. Several months later, I called him again and said, I'm sorry. So eventually, the parks, that we presented a significant proposal that we contacted Tony, we found our way to him. He said, yes, our community would qualify, although I heard him complaining about it this morning. It should work. We then began seeking more information and approval. Eventually, the park said, then the group that we split away from, because we couldn't work together, decided that they wanted to submit a contraception proposal, which they did. And then the park said, we're not going to decide. Your community has to decide. They punted it back to our community council. There was another long, drawn-out struggle, and finally the community council picked sterilization. That was sent back to the park board, who approved it. At that point, the parks endorsed a submission for a research permit that Tony submitted. The parks guy that ran their culling program came to Columbus with me to meet with the ODNR folks, and Tony was on the phone. So I think between our Cincinnati Park support and the credibility Tony has with those DNR folks, and the fact that we had really done a pretty serious amount of research and put together a pretty impressive proposal, or Laurie mostly did, they took it seriously. They granted us a 3-year research permit with a renewal possibility if we meet certain goals. We chose sterilization. I just want to say this, out of all the options, because when we looked closely at it, and the parks had required that we have results quickly. They wanted to call, they were convinced, they had convinced themselves and others that if they didn't reduce that population soon, there was going to be significant damage. So we needed to come up with something that would work quickly, and so this was the only option that we could see that would produce those kinds of quick results. As you can see, they've worked pretty well. My time is up. So we began forming a 501c3 organization with our permit, and Laurie's going to tell you the nuts and bolts.
Okay, so Bob's taken us through kind of how we got to the beginning, our origin story, but one of the things he didn't mention is that our deal with the parks, oops, I'm going backwards. Our deal with the parks was that we had to provide funding and we had to run the program ourselves. So even though normally this would probably be a city function, as it is in Hastings, this was really a function of a private organization, which was 3 individuals. So we had to basically form and run a 501c3, do all the fundraising, all of those things. So that seemed very daunting at the beginning, and in fact is, but in retrospect, I think it's been somewhat of a blessing in disguise, because with that responsibility came sort of the luxury of really running and controlling what happens on the ground, the contracting with White Buffalo, and the messaging around it, which we'll discuss, is really important in terms of getting community buy-in. And it's been a labor of love for us, so even though it's been a crazy amount of work, and as I say, you know, I'm talking about the nuts and bolts now, but you might just conclude after we go through it that we're just nuts. So just a few things, forming and managing your nonprofit. There's a couple of reasons to do it right. First, whether you have a nonprofit that takes in millions of dollars every year, or whether you have a nonprofit like us with an annual budget of under $50,000, your donors are entrusting you, and they deserve that you be professional. Another reason to do it right is the government requires it. You get a tax exemption from the IRS, and you've got to do things to deserve that. And then maybe most importantly is you really put your credibility on the line if you cut corners, and that puts your program and your deer at risk. We never wanted to distract from the success of our program, to distract from our mission by cutting corners and not being professional. So that's the reasons to do it right. A few things, obviously, you've got to file a 501c3 paperwork with whatever the rules are in your state. But a few things that are go to messaging that you might want to consider if you're in the same situation of having to form a 501c3 to actually implement the program is consider your corporate name carefully. Whenever I see nonprofit animal welfare organizations that start with citizens against or citizens for, that's perfectly fine, and you might choose to do that, but you have to realize that whatever comes after that, against or for, you are potentially alienating people who otherwise could be allies. There are people who falls firmly in the advocacy camp, like the 3 of us, and are all gung-ho about it. There are people who you're never going to convince. They're always going to be against whatever you do, even if it's successful. The broad swath of people are in the middle, and they really don't care what you do. They don't want the deer running into the road in front of their car. They don't want the deer destroying their garden. They want something to be done. They're not necessarily in the advocacy camp. You don't want to alienate that middle ground. So consider not, are you excluding or offending potential allies? Is it memorable, intuitive? Even, with our name, cliftondeer.org, this was Bob's great idea of putting the .org in our corporate name so people could find our website, although I still have people asking me, what's your website? So it's not 100% effective, but since our website is our main means of education and communication, we made it very intuitive. Another way of messaging is a purpose clause in your articles of incorporation. And again, to try to make this as big of a tent as possible, we covered both humane treatment of animals, which is near and dear to our hearts, and the ecological health of our community, because there are people who are kind of the plant guys like Bob, and then there are people who are more on the animal side of it. So that is just something to consider. In terms of, so we talked about the big tent things. There are also small tent things. We kept our board of directors and our officers small and nimble. Just because somebody gives time or money, as much as that's appreciated, they may not have the executive skills for a board. And even if you're running a very small nonprofit, you're still running a nonprofit, and it requires certain executive skills. So that's just something to keep in mind, that select leadership based on the skills you need. Nobody actually deserves to be part of the leadership team, and if they don't play well with others, and maybe or somebody who would be prone to have an interview with the media where they're alienating potential allies, that person you might not want to have on your leadership team. A few things, I'm going to skip over some of these things in the interest of time, but if something strikes your fancy and you want to come back to it in the questions, we certainly can. But take advantage of nonprofit resources. Our state and Ohio and others have a lot of nonprofit resources with the AG's office, the Attorney General's office, and webinars and such that can tell you what you need to know. You obviously need to get your 501c3 from the IRS, and how easy or hard this is, how much time it's going to take is probably how big you are. We got ours in a matter of about 6 days because our budget was small, but you might need more of a head start if your budget is going to be larger. In terms of budgeting, I would really encourage you to listen to the experts about what it will take to succeed. We could have gone to Tony and said, we can only pay for you to come for 3 field nights. And if we did that, he might be able to get us 50% of the deer. That's not going to reduce our population. Yeah, we'll have fewer fawns, but it's not going to reduce our population. So I would encourage you to ask the experts, ask your service provider, what is this going to take for you to be successful? And then backfill the budget from there and do the fundraising from there, rather than say, we can only spend this much, we're only willing to spend this much, and that limits what they can do. Because getting halfway, it's not, if your goal is to reduce your population, it's not going to be effective. So that's just a note on budgeting. Okay, so you have your 501c3, you have your budget, now you need to fundraise. We have always taken the approach that education and engaging the public is critical and integral to fundraising. You can't do one without the other. And a few sort of lessons learned, and some of these I'm echoing what the folks from Hastings-on-Hudson said, but we, from the beginning, committed to transparency. We also are humble about this. It's very disarming. If you have somebody criticizing your program, how do you know this has worked? This has never worked before. You don't know. What do they say when you say, you're right, this is research? Can I tell you why we think it's likely to work, what we're going to do, and the metrics we're going to use to see if we're successful? And that's very disarming. What is somebody going to say other than, okay, yeah, sure. Also, use your website to tell stories and to educate. We have on our website a report tag deer function. People can report, I saw doe 35, and then we always send them back an email telling roughly how old doe 35 is, how much she weighed when she was captured, whether she has any known associates, and where she likes to hang out, what year she was darted, and all that. And people really get to know the deer individually, and that's been a huge success in engaging the public. Don't let yourself be baited on social media. You don't have to respond to every mean tweet. In fact, if you value civility, you will lose the Twitter battle. So it's better just not to take the bait. Or if you do respond, one of the things that has been, I think, surprisingly successful, and probably we always turn these things over to Bob because of his mediation experience, but sometimes we get trolled on social media. And once a few years ago, we were trolled by a hunter. And I invited him, I reached out to him on Twitter and said, you know what? You raise good points, and we've given this a lot of thought, and we'd love to talk with you about it. Would you reach out to us by email? We can't do this by tweet. And he actually did. And Bob had a very respectful dialogue. Now, he's still a hunter. He still thinks our program is silly, but he stopped trolling us. So, that is something to consider. Meet people where they are. This goes back to allies. Not everybody has to be a vegan Buddhist to join your cause. If somebody is just concerned about auto accidents, say, this is how we're trying to reduce the deer population, which hopefully will reduce auto accidents. Listen to their concerns. Don't necessarily try to evangelize. They don't have to agree with you on every point. And then, just in terms of soliciting donations, beware of the misleading per deer cost. People get really fixated on that, and really you're talking about a program cost, and you're talking about what is it going to take to solve this problem. The parks have identified a problem, and what are the benefits of this? We're paying, we don't have to close the parks. For the hunting program, they have to close the parks. Tony comes in 5-6 nights, he's gone, the park's never closed, so people can enjoy the parks year-round. That's a benefit that our program gives. So just beware of the per deer cost conversation. It's misleading. I want to show you we've used humor a lot in our messaging. These are posters, 2 of about 5 different posters that we put up around town, and they were a big hit. Try to be self-depreciating. Some screenshots from our from our Facebook post. We do little, have you met doe 32, and then give some information about the different does. But we try to be light, self-depreciating, informative, not take ourselves too seriously. Sometimes we poke fun at ourselves, and I think that all helps in messaging. This is a screenshot from our website. As I said, we're committed to transparency, so we have a lot of information on our website, and we invite you to go look at that. One of the things we have there is a comparison to other non-lethal methods like PZP. So we explain to people why we chose sterilization, and frequently asked questions about sterilization. So that's been a real hit. Okay, just a few more words. Okay, so you've engaged the public, you have your fundraising, now you have some money. You obviously are going to need a nonprofit bank account, and I would just say that internal controls are your friends. Our biggest donation was $20,000 from the Humane Society grant. Our smallest was $1 from a 9-year-old. We owe both the internal controls of managing our money well and having financial statements that accurately show where the money went, and how we are accomplishing our mission. Annual reporting, just a note, most state attorney generals, if you're soliciting money from the public, you have to register and report annually. That's the case in Ohio, and I think most elsewhere. So in addition to annual reporting to the IRS, so something just, if you're in this situation, put it on your calendar. So preparing for field operations, just a few quick notes. Baiting is a very important preparation, both choosing the baiting locations. You're going to want to work with your service provider, you're probably, that's probably going to be on private property, so you're going to really need to establish good relationships with your bait site hosts, because you're going to be invading their privacy for about 6 weeks between the pre-baiting and the post-baiting, and traipsing across their yard every day. So Chris is our official Goodwill ambassador. She bakes cookies and sends personalized cards, but that personalized touch has helped. But just pay attention to the prep, plan your media strategy. The media is going to want to be there on site, and that's great if part of your mission is education. It's lousy for our service providers because then they're tripping over media, and it's really hard to dart a deer. It's especially hard if you dart a deer and you have a TV camera in your face. That's probably not going to happen. So just plan your media strategy in advance. And then surviving field operations, I think if you've done prep work, for us, it's been about a week each time, and if you've done the appropriate prep work, you're in good hands. As much as we care about our deer and the success of our program, I have to say we've been so impressed with Tony and Vicky. When they come in, they handle our deer with such care and gentleness, and we have so much confidence that it's very stressful. Things can go wrong. You can't control the weather, but it really is really an incredible thing to observe. And then just finally, a word on after field operations. It's really important to take stock while your memories are fresh on what went right, what went wrong, what to do differently for next year, because you will forget. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bob to talk about some of the things we've learned.
Okay, so I'd like to just start with something that's probably a repeat, but we realized as we got into this how really critical it is that you identify and be clear about your goals when you start, especially if you haven't yet chosen your mechanism or your program approach, because they matter. So if your goal is no kill, as ours was, and then it's got to be, almost has to be fertility control. I just don't know of any other options. If the goal is no kill, but you need immediate population reduction, our research and conclusion is sterilization is your better approach, at least until the immunocontraception is more effective. If you need immediate substantial population reduction, and you can live with some calling, with some, call first, reduce your population significantly, then sterilize, and that will get you quicker to your goals. If your goal is immediate, substantial, humane population reduction, then sharpshooting may be your best option. It is, if done right, it has been declared by the American Veterinary Association as humane euthanasia, and you can. It's not cheap, but it's probably much more humane than archery and effective, quick. The other thing we realized was, and I don't mean to keep harping on this, I think maybe it's because of my background this seems so relevant, but this passion that drives our program. I mean, we got started because of the passion of individuals for protecting deer, preserving them as part of the ecosystem. That's a two-edged sword. That passion, it's probably not an exaggeration to say that the internal dispute or tension between all of the people who were opposed to the archery was more of a hindrance to our success, our effectiveness, than any outside opposition. We didn't have political opposition. The ODNR granted us a permit when we asked them. surprisingly easily. The real, other than fundraising, which is always a challenge, that was the biggest problem. So it's understandable, if you think about revolutionaries in general, they're the ones that bring about a dramatic change, but they're not usually the ones that can then operate a new government or a new society that gets turned over to different people with different aptitudes and different inclinations. The trick is to use all of that passion to find a way to let it change the paradigm, which is what you're really doing. You're creating a culture change for the most part to bring a community around to being willing to invest in these kinds of things. It probably takes people making noise to get the topic on the table, and then it takes people that can negotiate and can take yes for an answer, as we found people in our group wouldn't do. Even after the park said, okay, let's collaborate. Some of the people in our group were still saying, they were still protesting in other parks. They were still denying the credibility of the park's determination for the need. One man sat in our room at one of our meetings, and we had an ODNR wildlife man there having a nice conversation. This one guy, who's a lawyer, didn't think he was moving fast enough and threatened to sue the ODNR. And it's like, geez, So somehow separating, somehow managing that whole process and making sure you move toward people that can work rationally and effectively to build and promote a program. One of the other things I'd say, and I hesitate to say this as emphatically or as strongly as it feels, but because I don't want to discourage anyone. But if you're talking about a citizen-initiated program like ours, where it's not a city, it's not a village, it's not a homeowners association that has resources and or staff that can really take these things on, it's really an enormous amount of work. And it takes a whole combination of skills that you won't find in one or two. We stopped many times and realized that I'm being told to click them. That we'd think about how did we do this and what did it take to do it. And we'd realize no two of us could have done this. And I'm not even sure how 3 and now 4 of us have done it, except just really dedication, especially when you're starting from scratch as we were. So it's what does it take to do this? We're not really kidding about most of these. Emotional intelligence, Chris provides that for us. She keeps us from killing ourselves and anyone else, and she keeps us, nice, even. She has a nice, mature way of approaching all these really dramatic problems or crises. The rest of it, you can probably see if you've been involved in these programs, you probably know it. If you don't have a city staff that's handling a lot of this, you're going to want to look for people that have these kinds of abilities. I'd like to say one thing about what's next. So this is a research permit we're working under. It's a research project, and that's the only way it could have happened. It is the way we're doing it. We're really serious about the research. We have an agreement with the ODNR for probably a renewal. If they only give 3 years, we can get a renewal if everything's going well. And we expect to do that. But at some point, this has to stop being research, and it's going to start either this is going to keep going or not. And we sort of feel like we've invested so much in this, and we really do care about the outcome of this project. And the science is looking very promising. We've been reluctant to make any claims, but you've seen the numbers. It looks like it's true. It looks like the migration rates are low. It looks like we're seeing a reduction in population already. It looks like it could really work. So how do we make this permanent? We've started thinking about that. We've started setting aside funds for training. We've been working with volunteer vets. We hope we have someone coming in again this year that's going to take some leadership, and she's probably fits the description John gave this morning, I think, of, a few years out. She's had a lot of experience with surgery, young enough to be ambitious and interested. And we have a young man that really wants to learn to be a darter, and we've sent him to schools. We've ask Tony to take him under his wing a little bit and see if he can tell us if he'll be worth it, and we'll invest further in him. But looking for a structure that we can build this into that can carry on eventually beyond us, but even beyond the research, it seems to be a really important step, and that's the one we're really thinking about. And that obviously is going to require convincing our state DNR to allow us to use this for management, not just research. We'll be thinking about that for the next year or two as well. And you know, we just keep putting one foot in front of the other and see where we end up. So if you have questions, Laurie and I would be happy to answer.